Hey guys, welcome to my studio. I'm Panos and today I'm going to do a rundown on the equipment I use for the band I have played with for the last 2 years. This video is about the gear I use, focusing on the reason I chose every component and how I set them up to serve the needs of my band. I think it's going to be really informative for all you guitar geeks. In order for you to understand the choices I've made, I'll try to describe my role in this band. I believe it's essential for every band member to be aware of his role in any band he participates, playing-wise and sound-wise. So, I'm the guitarist in a 6-piece band that plays modern mainstream pop rock songs. I mostly play the rhythm parts alongside the keyboards. I play a few intro themes and solos too, but mainly we are talking about open chords, power chords, arpeggios and riffs. As you can guess, the most important instrument in this band is lead vocals. If you happen to be a part of a group of this type, you'll find this series very interesting, as I try to explain why your Eric Johnson violin tone may be out of context here. I believe that if you care about the final mix the audience listens to, you have to sound in a way that serves the song, not your ego. So choose the appropriate equipment to achieve your goal easier. Whenever I choose and set up my gear, I try to think as a mixing engineer. My goal is to deliver guitar sounds that are as ready to mix as possible. Ideally, all of the sounds will sit in the mix without post-processing. For example, if you play mainly rhythm guitar, like me, you should consider that because the singer probably has the most important role in the song, the mixing engineer will try to make his voice as big and clear as possible in order for the lyrics to be heard. I guess that's happening because engineers still don't know that lyrics are a waste of time between solos. Anyway, if your guitar is mid-heavy, let's say like when you play a Les Paul with a tube screamer, you are going to mask the vocals, and unfortunately the engineer will either bring your lever down or try to dial some mids out, usually the first. You may have noticed that when you've been to a gig and the guitar was buried in the mix. Now you know why. Don't get me wrong, I don't mean that flat mids is always the best, but let's say we have to be aware of the mid frequencies we emphasize or not, depending on the style and the orchestration of the song. If you want to cut through the mix, the best way is to have the appropriate sound and let the engineer mix you louder. The only way to evaluate your choices of the equipment and its settings is in live conditions with good monitoring and from live recordings as well. I strongly suggest you record your gigs in order to know what the audience hears and how you sound in the mix. I use a Zoom H4 recorder that I mount on a mic stand next to the mixing desk. Of course, the opinion of the band's mixing engineer or maybe a fellow guitarist in the audience is also important. Remember, what sounds good in your bedroom when you play alone usually doesn't sound good at all in the mix where 2 or 3 instruments fight for a place in the same frequency bands. When you set up for a gig, a good idea is to have an amp stand so you can place the amp in an angle so it's facing your head, as in this position you have the most volume and treble and everyone else the least. You dial the volume and EQ while playing in the band and then let the engineer place the mic where it sounds best. As you have noticed, high frequencies are very directional, so if your amp was facing your knees, you'd hear a duller sound, leading you to dial the treble way up and the bass down, producing that way a thin and harsh sound. Moreover, you'd have to bring the volume up in order to hear yourself, destroying the mix on the stage and driving the engineer mad, as everyone now wants more volume on their monitor. Not to mention that your amp may already sound out of the mix, even with your mic muted, especially in small clubs. In case you use in-ear monitors, like me, I suggest you have the amp on the ground, not facing your head, so you don't have comp filtering issues, but still have the guitar amp interaction. As you can understand, all of these apply in case you play through a PA system. Okay, let's talk about the most important parts of my rig first, the guitar and the amp. The guitar I use is a 50th anniversary Fender American Deluxe Strat. For me, Stratocaster offers the most versatility with classic sound and looks, especially in low to mid-gain applications. In this Strat, I have replaced the Samarium Cobalt noiseless pickups with a Don Mare Super Sport set, which is an exact copy of a vintage 64 set. I consider noiseless single coil pickups a bit compressed and sterile sounding. I think they lack some treble and bass response too. I was looking for a set with all the characteristics we like about single coils, like responsiveness to the picks attack and clarity. These pickups are really smooth. If you think single coils sound thin, you'd better have a look on this set. If you prefer the sound of 50s with more quack, tight bass and clear mids, I recommend the Formvar 50 set. Another set that I like is the Total 60s from Rocket Fire that sounds something like an overwound 50s set to me. A really good sounding set if you want the typical Strat sound. Now if you're into 70s Strat sounds, I suggest you try the V70s from Shure that sound more aggressive with snappy tight lows and simmering highs. Pickups play a significant role on how the guitar sounds, so I highly recommend you try as many sets as possible until you find what sounds best to you. Moving on, this Strat originally had a 2-point bridge that I changed to a Fender vintage style 6-screw bridge. It stays in tune as good and affected the tone of the guitar in a good way. The bass now has a piano-like quality with more percussive attack. The guitar also has a much wider dynamic range and less honky mids. Hardware also plays a significant role on the guitar's tone, so if you want a classic Strat sound, you may need to try a vintage-styled bridge. Finally, I installed an Illich Electronics backplate. That's a passive noise-cancelling system that contains a low-impedance coil assembly that fully eliminates single-coil hum, while, as far as I can tell, it keeps the tone intact. Most of the venues I play already have noise issues, so now I have one less problem to take care of. These are a 3-way CRL selector switch, two 50 kΩ ETS pots with a 0.22 microfarad orange drop capacitor, and a treble bleed circuit so it doesn't get muddy when I back off the volume pot. I kept the original lock-in tuners as they stay in tune well and let me change a string quickly if it breaks during a song. I always use Ernie Boyle 2221 strings and Dunlop Tortex teardrop 1mm picks. Don't forget that the gauge and the material of the pick affect your tone significantly, so don't neglect to test lots of them until you find the type that suits your style. Moving on to the most important element of the rig, in my opinion, the amp. Imagine the best guitar into a cheap practice amp with an 8-inch speaker. I bet the result will not be very pleasant. On the other hand, if you plug a cheap guitar into a high-end tube amp with a good speaker, the result can be at least acceptable with many useful sounds at your disposal. Even with the best guitar and pedals, your tone will suffer if you haven't got an appropriate amp for your style. I think that applies mostly if you use a pedal board with lots of different sounds, like me. Of course, having a good amp isn't enough. You have to know how to dial it. Well, that's the hard part. So, this is a Hook R40, a handmade tube amp made in Holland. It features 40 watts from two Tanksol 6L6 power tubes, tube rectifier, 2-foot switchable channels, and a wonderful spring reverb. Unfortunately, I can't take it with me for all my gigs, so for now I use only the clean channel as I get all of the overdrive from my pedals. An important characteristic of this amp is that even with the volume on 1, it has the response of an amp before breakup. It sounds very alive and balanced. I like that it's not super clean, like a Fender Twin, as I use it mainly for pop rock sounds, where I prefer something more gritty. The lows are really tight for an open back cabinet, and you can dial in lots of treble without being harsh. It sounds huge, articulate and voiced perfect to sit in the mix, with the right guitar of course. I'll demonstrate some of these sounds later on. The speaker plays an important role in the sound and the headroom of an amp too. This is a G1265, an 8-ohm 12-inch 65-watt ceramic speaker from Celestion, which I consider a bit more hi-fi sounding in comparison to a Celestion Greenback or Vintage 30. I suggest you try one or two different speakers that the amp's manufacturer may recommend, so you find the one that matches best with your guitar and music style. I suggest, when you choose an amp and speaker, to watch out for three things: flabby lows, honky mids, or harsh treble. Avoid them. Another thing you want to consider is the loudness and the headroom of the amp. How loud an amp is and how long it stays clean depends on many factors, like the amp topology, wattage, speaker's efficiency, and of course the guitar's pickup's output. If you like to overdrive your single-channel amp, you should consider a low wattage model with little headroom, unless you only play in stadiums, or you heavily depend on attenuator. If you use only the clean channel of an amp as a canvas for your pedals, consider the fact that most tube amps, especially old ones, sound best just before breakup, so a 30 to 40 watt amp would be a better idea. For example, if you play a Les Paul into a 15 watt model and you want your amp to stay clean while you play an extra drama, you'd better forget it. As you see, everything relates to each other. One last thing you can experiment with is the preamp tubes, especially the one in the first position. different brands, different sounds. Pick the one that is best suited to your amp's voicing. To conclude, I believe the core of one sound is the interaction of the guitar and amp. Everything else depends on that direct sound. Without the right combination, you will always try to fix with additional gear what doesn't sound right in the first place. In the next part of this series, I talk about my pedal board and the peripherals like power supply units, cables, etc. If you are crazy about pedals like I am, don't miss it. Thanks for watching.